The Beach Boys, of course, have been around since 1961.
Let's not rub it in.
That's so. What took so long before you put out this memoir?
I'm the prince of procrastination, among other things. Well, from my point of view alone, I knew I know what I did, what part I played, and lived the life I've lived, and I didn't feel like it was so important to, write anything up until a couple of years ago when my father passed away, and I was thinking, wow, I would have really liked to have had more conversation with my dad about specific things in his life, and so I think that caused me to think, well, I'm 75 years old. I should, at the time we started dealing with the book, maybe a couple of years ago, I'm thinking, well, it would be probably a good idea if I documented my experience as one of the Beach Boys, which has been a phenomenal life. I mean, extraordinary experiences, and something to my children and grandchildren and fans of ours who had any interest at all in hearing from one of the guys who started the group and has lived his life performing for the last 55 years. So finally, I was able to associate with a really fine writer named Jim Hirsch, who's had some bestsellers on the New York Times bestseller list. And he really, he did so much research and helped to put things in context. What we were doing at this time in 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated, or when Martin Luther King was killed, or all the Vietnam War and Watts riots, things like this. I grew up not too far from Southern California and the Watts situation, so I lived so many experiences, and we were doing our songs while all this stuff is going on, whether it be the Vietnam War or what have you. So, Jim Hirsch helped me put it in context.
It's also fascinating to hear some of the real stories behind the songs. And of course, you were the co-writer on many of the Beach Boys' greatest songs, like Good Vibrations, Fun, 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 California Girls. And there's a great story in this book. You talk about Good Vibrations, how you wrote the lyrics to that song while you were driving to the studio. And I'm just fascinated that inspiration would hit you then. Why do you think the inspiration came to you then while you were driving towards the studio?
It was also panic, because I was on the way to the recording session and I had not written the lyrics. My cousin Brian asked me to come up with some lyrics to the verses for Good Vibrations. I'd come up with the part of Good Vibrations, the chorus that goes, I'm picking up good vibrations, she's giving me the excitations. So that part I had down, but I had not written the verse. And because it was 1966, and because the music was so avant-garde, it was so ethereal and strange, actually, compared to, California Girls or I Get Around or Fun, Fun, Fun. But when you heard the theremin, that strange sound over the track with the fantastic arrangement and everything, I said, wow, this is really weird sounding and avant-garde, but everybody can understand boy-girl attraction. I'm picking up good vibrations, she's giving me excitation. So because it was 1966 and there was the flower power thing going on, and the hippie kind of thing was going on in California, it made me think in terms of a girl who was really into peace and love and all those kinds of things. And I just wrote this flowery verse. I love the colorful clothes she wears and the way the sunlight plays upon her hair. I hear the sound of a gentle word on the wind that lifts her perfume through the air. I actually say in the book, I wanted to say incense, but I thought it'd be a bit much for a lot of people. And so I chickened out. I literally say I chickened out of saying incense. But it was inspired by the imagery of a girl who was a hippie girl who was into the times and into peace and love and all that kind of thing.
Now, I'm fascinated by the way certain rockers can be collaborators, and they can each give something special to sort of make the sum greater than the parts. You know, Lennon and McCartney, or of course the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards.
Right.
You obviously had a special connection with Brian Wilson. Why do you think? What did you bring to the table that helped Brian Wilson? What did Brian Wilson bring to the table that excited your imagination?
Well, first of all, we go back to childhood. I'm maybe a year older than Brian. He's my first cousin. We grew up together. We sang Everly Brothers songs together. We went to Wednesday night youth night at Angeles Mesa Presbyterian Church and would sing the church songs, and then we'd walk home singing Everly Brothers or doo-wop. And he became fascinated with the Four Freshmen. But Brian was incredibly gifted in terms of structuring chords, and he was fascinated by harmonies. The Four Freshmen he became obsessed with. We learned a few of their arrangements, one of which we still do to this day. It's called Their Hearts Were Full of Spring. We do it just a cappella, just voices, and it's a beautiful, beautiful song, and it's a beautiful type of music to perform. And we were always gravitated towards harmonies, and he was a master at creating the harmonies, chord progressions, and so on. I was more into hooks and lyrics. I was always fascinated by literature. I love languages and other cultures. So like I studied Spanish, in school. And I always liked, where did these words come from? Was it Latin? Was it Greek? Was it Sanskrit? So I was fascinated by sounds and languages and literature. Like I would get an A+ in English literature or American literature, and I'd get a D in chemistry. So I was not into science and math. I was into literature and culture and that kind of thing. So my contribution was the concepts and lyrics, and sometimes the hooks, like the I'm picking up good vibrations, or round, round, get around, I get around, that kind of thing, or let's go surfing now. Yeah, I came up with those ideas and those concepts, and yes, it was musical, but I give most of the musical credit to Brian, because he was so gifted at working with the musicians and structuring the chord progressions and all that stuff.
Now, for much of the Beach Boys' career, you didn't get the credit.
That's
and
true.
And that's sort of a running theme of the book, of not getting the credit for some of the songs until you brought a court case in the 90s, which firmly established the fact that you were the writer for some of these great songs, the co-writer for many of these great songs. Well, why did it take so long for you to take action, and how much money do you think you lost over the years by not having your name attached to some of these songs until the 90s?
Well, yes. My uncle Murray, Brian Dennison Carl Wilson's father, knew what music publishing was. I mean, I just had a vague knowledge of you write a songwriter contract and you say, okay, I wrote this song with Brian, let's say. But my uncle, I didn't even know what publishing was. My father was a sheet metal worker, and so was my grandfather. I worked as a sheet metal apprentice when I initially, before we started the group. And so it was very blue collar, and although they did very well, knew nothing about the music business and absolutely nothing about publishing. But my uncle did. And he took over the publishing as well as the management of the group. We fired him as our manager after a couple of years because he was just insufferable. He was really hard on his sons. But what he did was he took, and after several years, he sold the publishing to someone else. And until I met an attorney named Michael Flynn, who looked at what had been done to me to disenfranchise me and discredit me or not credit me, until I met him, I'd never met anybody who was able to or cared to advise me on how to rectify that. He was able to do that through some legal proceedings and stuff. And the ironic thing was that my cousin Brian did want to rectify it, but he was unable to deal with his father. And then towards the latter part of the 60s, he went into a period of decline and mental problems and so on, where he was in a conservatorship, and a conservatorship is imposed upon someone who cannot take care of themselves, their what do you call it, their business or arrangements or anything like that, because it'd be just taken advantage of. So Brian was in a conservatorship. It happened to be administered by an attorney. The attorney thought that too much time had passed, therefore I didn't have any standing to go back and rectify. Even forgetting right or wrong or what was ethical or not, it's irrelevant to many of the people in the law industry. So even though my cousin wanted to rectify it, he couldn't. And so my only recourse was to go to court to establish my authorship of 35 songs. Actually, I wrote several more with my cousin Brian, but 35, including Help Me Rhonda, I Get Around, California Girls, and several others.
Now, of course, you did a reunion tour with Brian not that long ago.
Right.
The book, you suggest you haven't talked to him in some time.
That's correct.
Have you heard from him recently? Do you plan to talk to him again? What is the status right now of your relationship with Brian Wilson?
If it were Brian and I together in a room and there's a piano around, we could write a song. There's no issues there, but it's not that way, because Brian's life is administered by, he has his own manager and agent, and his life is run by other people. So it's not just he and I. And so we did that tour together, and it was good from the standpoint of we were able to perform to a lot of people who wanted to see us together, and it was successful in that regard. But there were things done and the way in which it was done which were not good.
But could you see yourself collaborating with him again, touring with him again?
Only if it was just Brian.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what I found interesting is your book has just come out and it's getting reviewed everywhere. Brian Wilson just came up with a new memoir as well. Have you read that? Have you seen it yet?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
I read the book too.
Oh, yeah?
And he said something very nice about your song Kokomo, which is a song, of course, that you did after he left, that you co-wrote, and became a huge hit for the group. And I wanted to read you something he wrote. I want to get your reaction to it. He said, and this is Brian Wilson in his new memoir, "The first time I heard it on the radio, I loved it," talking about Kokomo, "though I didn't even know it was the Beach Boys. When someone told me who was singing, I couldn't believe it. It had such a cool sound and such great harmonies, and the lyrics were so nice and relaxing." And then he asked somebody, "Can we go there? Because Kokomo's a real place." What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is, we tried to get him to record with us on that song, but he was under the tutelage, if you will, or under the spell, as some people would say, of Dr. Landy, a psychologist who governed his every move. And Landy would let Brian record with us only if Landy could be the co-writer or the co-producer of the record and stuff. And we had Terry Melcher was the producer. Now, Terry Melcher had produced the Byrds and Paul Revere and the Raiders. He was very successful at what he did. And so he didn't need Gene Landy's help. So Gene kept him away. What happened, though, we did a video in Florida of Kokomo, and Brian was in the video, but he wasn't on the record. And I wrote that song with Terry Melcher and John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas.
Are you surprised that Brian Wilson would think that Kokomo was maybe a real place that he could go to, or is that something that a lot of people sort of think?
Well, it's kind of a fictitious place, honestly. But an interesting thing is we got bags full of letters from school teachers who said our class wasn't very interested in geography. But when they heard Aruba, Jamaica, Bermuda, Bahamas, where are all these places?
You're helping kids across America.
The kids could relate to it through the music, which is pretty fascinating.
Now, of course, a year ago, a movie came out called Love and Mercy. It was all about the birth of the Beach Boys, and then, of course, Brian Wilson's later life. I've heard that you haven't seen the movie yet.
Correct.
You think you'll ever get around to seeing it, and why have you kept away from it?
Probably. It was supposed to be set up for us to see a showing, but they pulled it. They didn't let us see it. So I have yet to see it.
And there's some fascinating episodes in the book, and one that I want to get to about Charles Manson, In the 60s, Dennis Wilson, a member of the band, had an encounter with Manson, and you did too. Of course, Charles Manson's one of the most notorious killers of the 60s. Tell me a bit about your encounter with Charles Manson and how that affected you.
Dennis had more than an encounter. Dennis was his roommate for a while. Yeah, Dennis picked up a couple of girls who were hitchhiking, and he took them to his home in the Pacific Palisades. He had rented a place, and it's called Will Rogers State Park out Sunset. It's a really beautiful area. He had a what do you call it? Log cabin type of house, and it was large enough to where it could accommodate a lot of people. Well, these girls were a couple of Charlie's girls. They lived in a place called Spawn Ranch, which is outside of L.A. So we'd come back from a tour. Dennis went home, and Charlie was living in his house along with many of the other girls. Dennis was under the spell of Charlie for a while until he saw him. As Dennis told me, I said, "Why are you so uptight today, Dennis?" He says, "Well, I was out at the ranch, meaning Spawn Ranch, and I saw Charlie blow away a black cat, meaning a human being, with an M16 rifle and stuff him down a well at Spawn Ranch." He never told that to anybody. He told it to me and maybe a couple other people like Terry Milcher and a couple other people. That's it. He never spoke to the authorities about that.
Did you ever find out who that person was that was killed?
No, I have no idea. See, because I only met Charlie Manson, I only recall meeting him once. That was when we were invited to Dennis's home to have dinner.
And one of the Manson family tried to get into the shower with you, right?
No, what it was is we had dinner, and then they adjourned to the den, and Charlie turned on a strobe light and passed out. It was supposed to be LSD, which I never had, so I declined. And I didn't join in that party. We were the only people. Bruce Johnson and I went for dinner at their invitation, and we were the only people with clothing on. It was rather unusual. So I left. I didn't get involved in that whole mess, and went to take a shower because it had been a hot day, and we were on our way back to the studio, and this girl came into the shower, and then Charlie Manson shows up and says, "You can't do that." I said, "Excuse me? You can't leave the group." He looked at me like with this Charlie Manson stare. It was not good. And I got out of there as quickly as I could, and on our way back to the studio at Brian's house where we were recording, I said, "Well, Dennis, you really have an interesting character on your hands now." So that was my only time that I had any interaction with Charlie. But I was living in my place in Manhattan Beach. My wife and I, Suzanne, had split up. I was living there, and somebody called my phone and said, "Prepare to die, pig." And that was not a fun call to receive. So that was the diabolical part of that time period. There's the divine and the diabolical in the book. I talk about being in India with Maharishi and the Beatles.
I want to get into that, the divine
thing.
part, because you're very into meditation. You feel it's helped change your life.
I know it has.
It's prevented addictions and opened your mind. And
absolutely.
in the book, you talk about being very competitive with the Beatles, but then you encountered the Beatles in India during a trip that helped open your mind up to meditation. Tell me a bit about that and how that went and what it was like to sort of interact with the Beatles in India.
It was fascinating. I and George Harrison both had our birthdays, he on February 25th, I on March 15th, 1968. We both had our birthdays in India with music and fireworks and cake and everything else. It was really a fun time. And I was given a painting of Maharishi's master, who they call Gurudev. George is an extremely spiritual guy. He loved all things Indian. In fact, he studied sitar with Ravi Shankar, and he loved the Hare Krishna people. And he loved his meditation, he loved Maharishi, he loved all things Indian, including the food, and so do I. Anyway, we had a lot of rapport that way. We both did, And when he passed away, I was feeling very melancholy and remembering those times spent in India where we'd talk and meditate together and what have you. And so I wrote this tribute to George, which I'll do tomorrow night in Central Park, at the summer stage. It's called Pisces Brothers, and it has to do with the spirituality and the influence that Maharishi had, and for him, the Hare Krishna people and stuff. So yes, there was a lot of interaction there, and it was on a spiritual level, and it was interesting because we were in India meditating in search of inner peace and perhaps world peace when the Vietnam War was escalating. It was kind of weird. So when you talk about diabolical and divine, or I do, Charlie Manson, Maharishi, war, peace, meditation, destruction.
Well, it brings up another question. Throughout the book, you talk about the fact that there are things going on in the '60s that the Beach Boys aren't directly writing about,
Right.
like Vietnam,
Right.
like race relations,
Mm-hmm.
and so the band doesn't get invited to Woodstock. Do you look back with any kind of regrets, thinking maybe should we have written songs that confronted some of the political and social realities of the time, or do you feel like that wasn't the Beach Boys' place?
I've always thought that life is challenging enough without dwelling on negativity. And so we made a conscious decision, at least I did, to accentuate the positive, like good vibrations. I mean, we could have sung about a lot of things in the 60s, but we said good vibrations. Or The Warmth of the Sun was a song we did in '63, and we woke up in the morning after writing it. President Kennedy was taken to the hospital in Dallas. Well, we could have changed the words to conform to that tragic event, but we didn't. The Warmth of the Sun was I think a metaphor or analogy, I'm not sure which, but it had to do with feeling the euphoria of love or at least infatuation, and yet it's not real. It went away. But still you had the memory of having felt that elation, and that was the warmth of the sun. So it was a thing that didn't work out. It was a little bit negative, but you found something good in it. And what I always strove to do in writing a song was to try to find something positive to communicate, because I felt that people's lives are challenging enough, and the world's challenging enough, and it still is. It always has been. They talk about a more innocent time and stuff, but when I was in grade school, they taught us to duck under the desk because the Russians are going to A-bomb us. So that wasn't so nice, so so life's always been a challenge, and the history of mankind has been the history of war and horrible things. So that's why I was so attracted to meditation and Maharishi's message, which is enough people meditated to become a peaceful world.
There's also a lot of there's a theme of family in your book, Good Vibrations.
Mm-hmm.
And one family question I have for you is that it's interesting that your brother Stan was a great basketball player.
He was.
And his son is Kevin Love,
Exactly.
who is one of the stars of the Cleveland Cavaliers.
He sure is.
So what I want to know is Kevin Love, is he into the Beach Boys? Can he sing, or
No,
do you know him very well?
He can sing, but he can play basketball and win the championship, but he's shy about getting out on stage.
So Kevin Love is your nephew. Has he come
Yeah.
to your shows?
Oh, yeah.
You brought him up on stage. I mean, what's that like?
My wife Jacqueline would read The Night Before Christmas when he was a little kid. So yeah, we've known him all his life. Yeah, I've stayed at his house in Cleveland and gone to some games.
Now, another fascinating theme of the book is the fact that you talk about the fact that early on in your career, the Beach Boys were making maybe 3 cents per album, and the record company was making over $1.
Oh yeah.
And I'm wondering what your perspective is on the music world today, with so many ways of getting music, whether it's streaming, whether it's downloading the music. There's always a sense among some artists that they're not getting what they deserve. They're not being paid for their efforts. You think things are worse now than they were when you started, or about the same in the music industry in terms of artists getting paid what they deserve?
I think things are better and they're worse. at the same time. Meaning, you can spend $1 million doing an album, but there's no physical products being sold, or not so many. It's downloaded, streamed, whatever. So on the one hand, you don't get paid as much for your efforts. On the other hand, it can reach millions of people, like overnight, through the internet. So if you have something that's people want to hear and want to own and want to, possess and be able to play for themselves, then you could have 10 million, 100 million people having that song, whether it's on their phone or whatever. Now, I, from the old school, think you're better off hearing it on vinyl. In fact, my daughter, Amba, who's 20 years old, she, for several years, has been collecting LPs. I mean, yes, she has Amy Winehouse LPs and Lana Del Rey, but she also has Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, the Stones, everything. She'll wear a Rolling Stones t-shirt around the house just to piss me off. But it doesn't. I think it's great that she loves all kinds of music. She'll sing Etta James or any kind of music, and she's a musical encyclopedia. But she also likes, some of the rap stuff and electronic stuff, which I don't relate to. And she'll say, "This is a really great song." I said, "There's only one problem, but it's not a song. There's some good beats, I have to admit. It's got a good groove to it. But the guy's rapping about dog shit," is what I say. I mean, that's how I talk to my daughter. Oh, maybe I should temper my statements, but that's the way it is.
Well, we're going to open this up to some questions from our audience. If you have questions for Mike Love of the Beach Boys about the new book, about some of your favorite Beach Boys songs, Fun, 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 California Girl, Good Vibrations, the list goes on. Yes.
There's one you forgot, though.
Oh, there's so many I forgot.
No, Wipeout with the Fat Boys. That was a hit. That was like number one on MTV for a while. I mean, they were on the beach sinking the surfboards in the sand. We were in Times Square with the Kangol caps and the chains and stuff. That was a fun record.
Okay, right there.
When you were walking home with your cousins singing the Everly Brothers, did you just naturally fall into the harmonies?
Oh, yeah. Since childhood, long before we were teenagers, we would get together Christmas caroling is a prime example. We would go around the neighborhood doing Christmas carols. My dad would bring a truck home, and the adults would get on the truck, the kids would follow the truck around, and we'd sing Christmas carols around the neighborhood. Then we'd come back and have a big feast and sing some more songs. The kids would split off and do their rock and roll and R&B, and the parents would go and do their standards, the old folks music. So that was how I grew up. So yeah, we always appreciated harmonizing and singing together. Because my mom's side of the family was incredibly musical. In fact, my mother sang on the radio in the 30s before she was married, which is a big deal. She sang Madame Butterfly, light opera and stuff like that. In fact, she used to wake us up to opera music to go to school. As a result, I've been challenged to appreciate opera ever since, because I associate it with getting up to go to school, at 6:30 in the morning. Yeah, it's tough. Go ahead.
Right there?
Sorry.
I've always been curious, the creative process of writing songs. It's not a continuous stream. Great artists like yourself have these incredible hits like Endless Summer, which I've listened to 1,000,000 times, and have these great periods, and then there's dormant periods. Just commenting on that, I mean, why is that? Why isn't it a steady stream of,
There can be numerous reasons for that. One thing, in our case, the incursion of drugs and what it did to our group and our family, it really set Brian back. And he was basically our quarterback in the studio, and it's like as if the quarterback had been taken out of the game, and so it fell to others to produce and stuff like that. Whereas once he was, I call him the Stalin of the studio, but he was brilliant and gifted. But after experiencing some negative things with drugs, in particular LSD, he wasn't the same anymore. So it was kind of like losing your loved one, losing your friend. Everybody knows of family members who have succumbed to alcoholism, sometimes drug abuse and stuff like that. And so it's not unusual, but and some people can do stuff and be just fine, have a drink, no problem. But other people, it destroys their life. And the similar thing in certain types of drugs. And so that's my biggest regret, is not knowing how to deal with that and losing a best friend or a loved one to that kind of situation. So in our case, that didn't stop us from creating, but it impeded the flow of the hits. Up until Good Vibrations was our biggest hit in the 60s. That was the late 1966. And so Kokomo was 22 years later. Yeah. So we still create and we still made albums, just not the phenomenal success that we achieved in the early to mid 60s.
Right there?
Well, first, thank you for all the great music. I've been obsessed with the Beach Boys since day one.
Oh, thank you.
And I was just always curious, in the early 70s, Ricky Guitar and Blondie Chaplin joined the group.
Mm-hmm.
I know they were close to Carl.
Mm-hmm.
How did you feel about that?
I dug them. They're from South Africa. And the Beach Boys didn't get a lot of credit for being socially conscious or aware or anything like that, because we're, too lightweight, just singing about surfing and cars and girls and stuff like that, which I'll take it. I'm fine with it. But a lot of hipster kind of mentality, writers and critics would say, that's not very meaningful. Well, I think it's pretty meaningful to create happiness, my personal opinion. And so, but Blondie and Ricky, Ricky Fataar is a phenomenal drummer. Blondie was an amazing guitarist and a great singer. And so he sang, they sang and played with us for a period of time.
And there's a section about them in the book as well.
Yeah, right.
Talk about them.
They had another dimension, there's no question.
They did, yeah, a bluesier kind of a thing. Yeah.
You talk a bit about critics just now.
Oh, I did.
It
slipped.
Well, one question I have is, if anyone goes on the internet or reads many books have been written about the Beach Boys, there are always these rumors that come up whether or not you played any role in, for example, delaying Smile, which is the long-awaited project that Brian Wilson was sort of helming that didn't get released under the Beach Boys name, and then he later released as a solo project.
Right.
And you just talk about this in the book, but do you feel any criticism from you about whether the songs were up to snuff? Played any role in delaying that, or
No.
what role did you play? Do you think?
Zero. I played zero role in the delay of Smile album. Brian overreacted to some LSD trip that he'd taken, and he thought that this session that had to do with fire. It was called Fire. He had the musicians creating all these fire sounds and stuff. And it was very dramatic. But he thought that there were more fires than usual in L.A. at the time, and it freaked him out. He was overly sensitized by the drug experience, and he shelved the album. Didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore for many years.
Do you feel if that album had been finished, that the Beach Boys, that album would have been like your Sgt. Pepper's? It would have been ranked along that kind of an album?
I personally don't think so, because I took exception to a lot of the lyrics, which were a bit obtuse. They didn't relate. See, I look at lyrics as a vehicle to communicate, but not everybody does look at them that way. Sometimes I use the term acid alliteration, LSD meaning acid, alliteration meaning the way that the words flow. And so there were certain types of lyrics associated with some of those songs in the Smile album. Now, mind you, the tracks, the musical part was brilliant, genius stuff, but the lyrics I had exception to, and I'm sensitive to lyrics, as I mentioned in the beginning.
Well, I guess that's sort of my question then.
What?
If we could change history and have you have more of a role in creating the lyrics for Smile, and had it been released at the same time Sgt. Pepper's was released, which might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that would have changed rock history? Do you think it would have been the masterpiece you guys were looking for at that time?
That's possible, but I wasn't asked. I wasn't asked. See, Brian was writing with some other people, so it didn't occur. It wasn't asked.
And I hate to leave unless it's such a bad note. So I'm going to ask you one more question
Go
about
ahead.
do you see? I know you said you haven't talked to Brian Wilson recently, but were he to call you and say, "Hey, let's go back on the road," would that happen?
We were going to record an album. He wanted to do a rock and roll album. We even talked about specific songs that we wanted to cover and re-record. And I was told that I was going to be able to get together and write with him, but it was disallowed by the management and production of that 50th whole thing. So what you're asking theoretically is, yes, that would be theoretically possible were it to be Brian and I, but that's not the reality. It's not that easy because his life is governed by a certain situation, and I never got the opportunity to write with him like I was told I was going to be able to do. And the way things were run with that 50th, there were shows put on sale without my knowledge and commitments made and expenses entered into without my approval or knowledge, and that's not cool. And ultimately, at the end of it all, the tour, they said, I fired Brian and Al. That is not true. I didn't fire anybody. We had a contracted, agreed upon amount of shows we did. We finished it, and it was incumbent upon me to go back and do what I have been doing, which is touring as the Beach Boys for many years. So there was some unfairness there and outright inaccuracies. So I mean, theoretically, if everything was perfect, there wouldn't have been drugs. I'd be able to sit down at a piano with Brian and create music. I would love that, but that's not the reality.
And of course, you still do tour as the Beach Boys. Mm-hmm. How long do you think you can keep that going? Do you see this going for 10, 20 years? How long do you think the Beach Boys will exist as a touring entity?
I'm going to ask Tony Bennett. He's 90 and he sounds fantastic. Yeah, but he's in good health. He paints. He sings. He's great. It's a great thing that we do because it creates so much happiness with so many people. Yeah.
Well, Mike Love, the Beach Boys, thanks for coming to the Wall Street Journal.
Chris.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.